This is The Download from Sounds Profitable, your daily source for the essential news in the business of podcasting. I'm Gavin Gaddis. Here's what you need to know for today, Thursday, May 28th. First up, what is a podcast? Podcast Industry Taskforce forms to determine definition and more. The Alliance for Measurement in Podcasting, or just AMP, is a task force of industry leaders from podcast platforms, advertisers, publishers, and creators built to future-proof podcasting and address the industry's measurement challenges. Formed in July of 2025 in secret, the task force includes executives from Oxford Road, Spotify, BetterHelp, DraftKings, Flight Story, Libsyn, SiriusXM Media, United Talent Agency, and Podscribe. AMP's three focus areas are standardizing impression metrics, developing cross-platform performance measurement, and defining the term podcast with a universal classification that informs industry sizing, buying, selling, and measurement. Oxford Road will introduce a comprehensive measurement and attribution framework at its CAO Summit, July 22nd and 23rd at the Terranea Resort in Rancho Palos Verdes, California. Next up, Radio Podcasting and the Portuguese Man of War by Tom Webster. This week's Sounds Profitable newsletter looks at a slide of data from the Podcast Advertising Landscape 2025 that shows the Venn diagram overlap of AM/FM primes and podcast primes. In advertising landscape terminology, a prime is somebody who uses a media channel every day and ranks it among their top 4 or 5 ad-supported media choices on a typical day. In that Venn diagram, AM/FM radio primes and podcast primes only have 1.4% overlap. In other words, radio and podcasting's most passionate audiences are not also consuming the other medium. Webster recalls the Portuguese Man of War, which looks like a simple jellyfish, but is actually several organisms working symbiotically. Radio and podcasting look similar, but buying both channels creates a stronger combined asset. Next up, Magellan. Podcast advertising goes global as non-U.S. spending surges 79% in Q1. Inside Audio Marketing covers podcast advertising market trends H1 2026, a global analysis Magellan AI debuted during the podcast show London. According to the report, global podcast ad spend is estimated to have totaled around $3.94 billion in 2025, with monthly spend maxing out at $400 million for the first time in December, with markets measured by Magellan AI. This includes the U.S., UK, Canada, Ireland, Germany, France, Spain, and Australia. Rapid growth in Germany, France, the UK, and Ireland drove a 79% year-over-year increase in non-U.S. podcast advertising spend in Q1 2026. Different markets bring different focuses, with 84% of French podcast ad spend going to brand awareness campaigns. Canada, by contrast, focuses on performance marketing, 37% of podcast ad spend tracked by Magellan AI. On the subject of global podcast advertising and Canadian data specifically, Triton Digital has also just published its Canada Podcast Ranker for April 2026, link in today's issue. Next up, improving AI labels for viewers and creators. The YouTube team blog has published a new post explaining changes to labels for AI-generated content. For long-form YouTube videos, the label for photorealistic and meaningfully AI-altered or generated content will now appear directly below the video player, above the description. In Shorts, the label will appear as an overlay on the video itself. Pod News Commentary highlights YouTube's move as a, quote, stark contrast, end quote, to the podcast industry's lack of a unified front to label AI-generated content, or, where AI guidelines exist, a lack of enforcement. For our final top story, Canada wants a bigger cut from Netflix, Spotify, and Disney. Now comes the hard part. The Streaming Wars covers the Canadian Radio, Television, and Telecommunications Commission, or CRTC, expanding Canada's digital media contribution framework to raise foreign streaming and audio services from 5% to 15%. Streamers like Netflix, Disney Plus, and Spotify will need to pay more money to the Canadian content production ecosystem. While more money for local cultural content looks good on paper, the Streaming Wars staff notes that more funding does not guarantee Canada's policymakers can direct billions of dollars to the cultural voices the system is meant to support. As for the rest of the news, self-help podcaster Jay Shetty has signed a deal to bring the video version of his show On Purpose exclusively to Spotify and Netflix starting July 13th. Ashley Carmen sources say the deal is worth as much as $100 million over multiple years. European digital advertising platform Azerion has announced a direct integration of Hawk DSP and Spotify Ad Exchange. This Tuesday, Everybody Knows But Me from Next Chapter Podcast and Companion Arts reached #1 on the Apple Podcast Personal Journals chart. Congratulations. Acast Chief Communications and Brand Officer Lizzie Pollett will be hosting the panel conversation, The Podcasting Blueprint, 10 Years of Laughter and Loyalty at South by Southwest London next week on June 3rd with Ellis James and John Robbins. TubeFilter has covered the announcement of Netflix's first daily live show in the form of real-time syndication of episodes of The Breakfast Club starting June 1st at 6 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. In a sponsored segment in today's issue of Pod News, PodSEO, Pod SEO, highlights its existing tool to generate Instagram Reels from podcast audio, as well as their plans to add Facebook, TikTok, and LinkedIn video support. And finally, a recent Right Side Up newsletter rounds up 4 case studies of how it helped companies turn, quote, complex growth problems into clearer strategy and stronger performance, end quote. That does it for today's episode. You can find links to everything I just talked about by clicking the one link in your show notes. That will take you to today's episode post on soundsprofitable.com, where you can also get a subscription to the newsletter version and receive every issue of the download direct to your email inbox. Today's issue was written and produced by myself, Molly DeMillier, Tom Webster, and Brian Barletta. For Sounds Profitable, I'm Gavin Gaddis, and we'll see you tomorrow morning for the Friday recap.